The rain was falling thick that night, heavy as stones, drumming across the rooftop of a hotel that glittered like a glass giant stabbed into the sky. The city below was alive. Horns, neon lights, laughter spilling out of bars. But up here, above it all, a billionaire stood at the edge, swaying slightly, his expensive shoes inches from eternity. His name was Victor Draymont, though the newspapers called him the Iron King. Tonight he wasn't a king. Tonight, he was a man on the verge of throwing himself away. And no one was supposed to be there. No one but the ghosts in his blood. Yet fate is stubborn. Fate sends the uninvited guest, always at the moment when the silence screams the loudest. She came quietly, clutching cleaning rags, expecting nothing but another shift where she would be invisible. Coraline Morel, a maid with shadows in her eyes, opened the terrace door and froze. There he was, stiff as a cross planted against the night. And there she was, trembling but grounded, staring at him with a kind of horror that had lived in her soul long before this evening. My children, listen to me closely. Some stories begin with a birth, a wedding, or an ending. But this story begins with a grip, small, fragile hands reaching for a powerful man's sleeve as the storm threatened to take him. Life does not always warn you when the past and the future collide. She moved before thought could stop her. Sir, please. Her cry cracked against the thunder. Victor turned, slowly, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He looked at her, but not really at her. More like looking past her, like looking through a memory. You don't understand. His voice came low, almost broken. Everything I built is gone. Every friend I trusted has left. There is no reason to keep breathing. His words carried the weight of steel collapsing. But, Coraline stammered, terrified yet bold. Maybe you built the wrong things. Maybe the wrong people left. But you don't get to decide tonight that your story is finished. Her hands clung tighter to his sleeve, rain mixing with her sweat. She was just a maid, yes, but in that second she was stronger than him. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. He blinked, startled. The rain ran into his eyes, making it easier to believe the wetness there was not tears, but water. Somewhere deep, her trembling voice cracked through the walls he had built for decades. That voice, it had an echo he thought long dead. And I ask you, children, pause with me here. What would you do, standing in her shoes? Would you risk your life to save the man who looked ready to die? Or would you let him fall, believing the world was already broken enough to spare him mercy? Think, because some of you may one day hold another life in your grip, when you least expect it. Coraline's knuckles blanched white against his sleeve. The wind pulled hard, howling like an audience demanding the final act. He staggered, almost dragging her with him, until she pressed her weight backward, teeth clenched, whispering with all the force she had, "Nothing is gone, sir. Not until you decide to let it be gone." A pause, long as a prayer. Victor closed his eyes. Then, he stepped back. You would think she saved a stranger, yes? That's what she thought too. But the truth waiting in silence was far heavier. The man she pulled from the edge was not a stranger at all. He was the wound she had carried in secret her entire life. The security guards stormed in, hurrying toward them. They pulled Victor away, mumbling protocols, thanking Coraline briefly before shoving her aside, as if she was just part of the furniture. Her chest heaved. No one saw the quiet storm breaking inside her, no one but me, the elder telling you this tale. And as Victor was led off, something curious happened. His gaze did not leave her. His lips parted, whispering weakly, almost with disbelief, "Morel." That name. That old name. My children, it was the stone tossed into waters still and black. She froze. Her surname had no value in this glittering world, no wealth, no rank. Yet when he said it, the color drained from his face, as though a ghost had crawled back into his body. Ask yourself, how could a king, a titan among men, recognize the last name of a maid? How could power and poverty suddenly crash in a single word? And so I leave you here, under the storm, with Victor Draymont staring at Coraline Morel and whispering her mother's cursed name. The rain did not stop. Their histories did not stop. And you, too, must not stop, because the secrets unravel in the very next breath. Tell me, before we continue, if you were Coraline, how would you feel hearing your forgotten surname tremble on the lips of a stranger ready to leap? The morning after the storm, the hotel lobby was buzzing like a nest kicked open. Staff whispered, reporters sniffed around the gates, and headlines were already hinting at the Draymont disaster. Coraline walked silently between them, her maid's uniform still damp from the night before, though no one seemed to remember she existed. A billionaire might have fallen to his death, yet the one who held him back was invisible. Children, let this sink into your heart. The world will talk endlessly about money lost, contracts broken, and empires shaken, yet how quickly the poor hand that held life itself is forgotten. Still, her mind spun like wheels on ice. She could feel the word he had breathed, Morel, echoing in her chest. Why would he say her name, her mother's name, that same name she had once hated for being both plain and heavy? Why had it shaken him that way? She wiped tables in silence, yet her thoughts were louder than any gossip floating in the air. That night replayed, the rain, his hollow eyes, the pull of his arm, the strange recognition. Like a river carving a canyon, the memory was cutting into her until something new was exposed. And let me pause here, my dear friends. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Do not forget, these stories carry not just entertainment but the mirrors of life itself. Coraline remembered her mother, bent over buckets, scrubbing marble that belonged to strangers. She remembered how those hands cracked, bled, and kept working anyway. Her mother had been silent about love, silent about sorrow, but one phrase she often whispered came back to Coraline now. Some answers are poison. Do not drink them. But that poison was burning its way toward her, even without her choice. By noon, when she was changing linens in a penthouse room, a message came. Not written, not polite, but sharp as a command. Mr. Draymont requests to see you. Immediately. Her heart dropped into her stomach. Staff members glanced at her like she had been marked. What business could royalty have with the servant girl? What word could demand her presence in a suite drenched in silence? Children, this is where the weight of the rooftop night begins to shift. She saved a man from death. What she did not know was that he was about to take away the illusion she called her life. Prepare yourself, for the name Morel is about to break its silence. Justice often enters quietly, like a shadow sliding across a floor. And so let us move forward. The doors of his private suite closed behind her with a soft snap. The kind of sound that tells you, whether you know it or not, you may not leave unchanged. Coraline stood in the corner, clutching her hands together, her soaked shoes squeaking against the polished floor. There sat Victor Draymont, the man considered unshakable. Yet his suit was wrinkled, his tie loose, his hair grayer than the world ever saw. Wealth can buy 1,000 images, but it cannot erase the truth leaking out of tired eyes. He stared at her for a long stretch of silence, long enough that she felt like dust under a magnifying glass. Then at last he asked, his voice low, "What is your name?" Coraline's throat tightened. Coraline. Coraline Morel. The air seemed to fold inward. His hand, that powerful hand known for signatures, deals, and courtroom victories, now trembled against the armrest. The name cut him open. She didn't yet know why. And here, children, I lean closer to you. Do you feel that? Curiosity gnaws harder than hunger. Who was this man to her? What blood thread tied their fates together in secret? Coraline waited, restless and uncomfortable. "Why do you look at me like that?" she demanded softly. "I am just the maid." But that word, just, hit him like a nail in the chest. His eyes closed for a moment, flashes of memory rolling through him. A woman in tears, a decision made in arrogance, a child he had never held. All buried once underneath money and empire, now alive again in a trembling maid standing across the room. "My child," the words almost escaped his mouth, but he bit them back. Will he confess, or will pride strangle the truth again? He leaned forward, whispering so softly she almost did not hear. You remind me of someone. His gaze carried the weight of confession without words. And before silence choked the room entirely, I will leave you hanging there too, because truth is sharpened by delay. The confession finally spilled like glass breaking on a tile floor. Victor's voice cracked when he said it. Coraline, you are my daughter. Her body went cold. It was impossible, unbearable. For years she had hated the faceless silhouette who abandoned her mother, who never cared for the nights she cried herself dry while her child asked, "Where is he? Why is he not here?" And now, the man she had pulled from a rooftop claimed to be him. Coraline staggered back, shaking her head as tears welled. "No," she hissed. "No, that cannot be. My mother told me nothing but pain when I asked about him. She called him cruel, empty, gone. Child, imagine standing between love and hatred at the same time. Blood is both gift and burden, and when it lies hidden, its discovery stings deeper than knives." Victor dropped to his knees, his empire forgotten. "I was that man. I made myself a coward. I abandoned her because I was afraid losing money would mean losing life. But I see now, I lost life anyway." Coraline's fury shook her. She thought of hunger, humiliation, her mother's exhaustion, empty Christmas mornings, bullies telling her she had no father. Rage boiled against grief and disbelief inside her chest. "Why now?" she whispered, trembling. "Why tell me after all these years? Is it because you nearly jumped? You want mercy because you're afraid to die? You are not my father. You are a stranger in a suit. Children, taste this bitterness for a moment. Think of your worst wound being revealed not by fate, not by prayer, but by the very hand that caused it." That is where Coraline stood, betrayed by silence, and yet drowning in a truth she wished had never been spoken. And as she bolted out of the suite, the old man Victor sat alone, a titan reduced to rubble, holding his head in his hands. But Coraline's blood knew what her mind resisted. The truth would not stop hounding her. Secrets, once freed, are merciless. The storm did not end in her heart. That same night Coraline sat with her closest friend, another maid, whispering the story through cracked lips. "He said he's my father. That man. That monster in a suit." Her friend gasped. "Coraline, do not let him drag you into his world. People like him, men like him, eat souls and then hide the bones." But Coraline's silence was heavier than words. She remembered her mother, the bent back, the cracked hands, the quiet tears. She remembered the hunger as a child, the invisible life no one saw. And now, the man who had abandoned them was sitting in a golden tower, claiming her as the very blood he spat out decades ago. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. And while you answer, think deeply, what would you do? If the father who deserted you asked for forgiveness after decades of silence, would you give it, or break him with the same coldness he gave you? The days turned crueler. Victor's lawyers knocked on her door with money, with papers, with the polished smile of rich men who thought every wound could be bought. They tried to paint it as generosity. She understood it as hush money. "Sign this, Miss Morel," they said. "You will be taken care of. You will never have to scrub floors again." But Coraline, her heart blazing with quiet fire, looked them in the eye, tore the check in half, and let the pieces fall at their polished shoes. "Tell me, my children, what burns hotter than the poor who refuse to be silenced by gold?" That flame is the flame of quiet justice. And in that moment, she drew the first line in the sand. Not with violence, not with rage, but with rejection of his fortune. But the question remained, could she reject the blood running in her veins? Could she walk away from truth, once revealed? The storm of courtrooms, scandals, and inheritance wars was already brewing on the horizon. It would not stay quiet for long. Coraline has spit on hush money and refused the price of silence. But what happens to a maid who dares to stand against a king? That, children, We shall see in the next steps of the tale. The echo of her ripped check still lingered when the world turned its gaze to her. Court papers, headlines, and whispers painted Coraline not as a daughter but as a scandal. The rivals of Victor Draymont had smelled blood, and they dragged her name into their war against him. One morning she walked past the newsstand outside the hotel, and there it was in bold letters, "The maid daughter who could destroy the Draymont empire." Children, remember this. Poverty is silent until someone attaches it to power. Then it becomes a weapon. Coraline stood in the courtroom days later, her uniform replaced by second-hand clothes she managed to sew neat. Around her, lawyers and reporters clicked their pens like vultures clicking beaks. Across the room sat Victor Draymont. No longer the Iron King, he looked older, smaller, yet the weight of power still clung to him. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Draymont, you are being asked directly. Is this young woman your child or not?" The entire hall leaned in. Even Coraline held her breath. The Titan lowered his head, and then raised it again, his voice low but sharp. "Yes. She is my daughter." In that moment silence turned into thunder. Gasps, the clicking of cameras, voices rising like a storm. Coraline's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to run, to throw his confession back in his face. But instead she stood still, her anger invisible but burning. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. And tell me this, if the truth that shamed you became the weapon others used, would you stand and be brave, or would you step away and leave it all to fall? As the court adjourned, Coraline knew her life would never again be the life of a nameless maid. Blood had forced her into a battlefield she never asked to join. But little did she know, the fight was only beginning. The cameras were gone, the hall was empty, but anger still filled her chest like smoke. She found Victor waiting in the hallway alone, his face pale. When she approached, his eyes lifted, searching hers for anything. Maybe sympathy, maybe mercy, maybe a tiny doorway back into her forgiveness. He whispered, "Coraline, I cannot undo what I have done. But I can face it. I want to change." She trembled, rage flickering in every line of her face. "Change? You left us. You left her to work her hands to the bone. You left me hungry, mocked, invisible. Now you stand here and speak of change? Tell me, would you change if I had not pulled you from that roof?" Children, this is fury born not from sudden anger but from decades of silence. Her words carried the weight of wounds long buried. Victor did not defend himself. He simply bowed his head. "Then tell me what to do. Tell me how to pay the price." But Coraline answered with a voice like steel, "If you want redemption, it isn't me who needs proof. Prove yourself to every woman you ignored, every soul you trampled, every worker you saw as disposable. Only then do you begin to repay what you owe." HI viewers, kindly join this moment. Would you forgive a father who begged at your feet, or would you let his guilt burn him down to the ground? Victor's eyes welled. Yet Coraline turned her back and walked away, leaving the once mighty king standing alone in a hallway echoing with the sound of his sins. But destiny was not done punishing him. The man who once owned legions was walking toward his greatest downfall. It happened fast. The takeover his enemies plotted finally struck its blade. Shares plummeted, board members abandoned him in herds, and the empire he had guarded with steel hands slipped away like sand in a river. Newspapers called it the fall of Draymont. His face appeared next to angry red arrows and words like failure, fraud, and ruin. Children, does it not strike you strange? A man can command towers, armies of staff, and oceans of money, yet lose everything in a single year. Power is a house built on wind when justice comes knocking. Victor packed what little pride he had left. His homes were sold, his empire gone. The very world that once bowed now mocked his name. But it was in that humiliation he stumbled into something he had not known in years: quiet decency. He visited soup kitchens. He stood in orphanages with no cameras following him. He gave quietly, asking for nothing in return. Stripped bare, He at last began to live like a man. At the same time, Coraline was approached by his enemies. They whispered promises of alliances, of money, of helping her replace Victor's legacy out of spite. But she knew their smiles carried poison. She stood in the courtroom again weeks later, her voice steady, though her heart trembled. "I am not here for revenge. I am here for truth." HI viewers, pause now. Tell me, if enemies of blood offered you crowns and riches to turn against a father who once ruined you, would you take the deal, or would you refuse even the sweetest poison? And as Victor sat across the room, stripped of gold, stripped of crowns, his daughter faced the world openly. But the road ahead was not only his fall, it was her rise. Coraline could have vanished into wealth. She could have traded her ragged years for soft pillows and marble floors. But instead, she used what restitution she had, the fraction of his fortune set aside, for something far brighter. She built a foundation. Not for herself, not for diamonds, not even for revenge, but for invisible women like her mother. Maids. Waitresses. Women bent over sinks in silence. She gave them voices, training, homes, and dignity. In the heart of the city rose a center named after her mother, the name once heavy now shining on stone. Children, let this remind you, true power is not gold in the bank. True power is lifting those who were once unseen. Victor watched from the shadows at her gatherings, wearing plain clothes, stripped of every sign of wealth. He sat quietly among the crowd in the back, listening to her voice echo, speaking justice her own way. But the years, the guilt, the weight of empire lost, these crept into his health. One afternoon, at a foundation event, he collapsed, his lips whispering her mother's name as medics rushed in. Coraline instinctively ran to him, her hand gripping his cold fingers as he slipped further toward the edge again, this time not by his choice, but by the body's surrender. HI viewers, what would you do? If you held in your hands the life of the father you hated, would you tighten your grip to hold him here, or loosen it and let him go to his grave with his guilt? And as the machines beeped and the crowd gasped, all hung in balance. Father and daughter. Betrayal and blood. Hate and mercy. Justice waiting for its final word. The years had led to this single room. Victor lay frail in a hospital bed, no crown, no company, just the weight of time pressing down. Coraline sat by his side, her heart a battlefield of anger and pity. The monitors ticked like the seconds before judgment. The old man's voice returns now, my children, for the moral is wrapping its arms around us. Listen closely. Justice sometimes comes with chains, sometimes with fire. But this story, this story carries quiet justice, the kind that whispers truth heavier than thunder. Victor's lips trembled. "I don't want forgiveness," he whispered hoarsely. "I want the chance to repair something before I leave. Even one thing. Even one soul." Tears burned Coraline's eyes. She had dreamed of hearing his apology as a little girl. Now that it arrived, it was both balm and poison. She leaned close, whispering, "Justice was never about revenge, Father. It was about truth. Children, riches fade. Blood carries scars. Silence grows heavy until broken. Justice comes, not loud, but steady." And outside this hospital room, the foundation of Coraline Morel grew, the name of her mother shining, lifting invisible women into light. Now, children, this is where our tale folds closed. A maid who saved a man on a rooftop. A billionaire who learned that crowns turn to dust. And the quiet justice that tied their lives into truth forever. Before you leave this story, take this with you. Wounds demand their voice. Arrogance builds empires, but humility rebuilds souls. And sometimes, the hand you hold in the storm is tied to you by blood you never knew flowed. So stay awake, for more tales will follow here, and you will not want to miss them. Subscribe, turn on your notification bell, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your words may inspire someone else, just as Coraline's truth inspired the invisible to rise from shadows. This story has ended, my children. But yours is still being written. My children, lean closer, for the ending of a tale is never truly its end. An epilogue is a shadow trailing behind every story, a whisper that lingers even after the curtains fall. And though Coraline's life seemed to close with justice, what came after was not silence at all. It was the hum of a new life, hard but honest, like an after-rain sky that keeps glistening though the storm has passed. Coraline walked out of that hospital some weeks later with heavy eyes. Victor Draymont was alive but fragile, his empire gone, his body frail, his soul weathered. Many expected him to vanish into memory, yet fate allowed him to live just long enough to watch the seeds he left behind grow, or choke. His name was once written above skyscrapers. Now it trembled on the lips of nurses and doctors, reduced to an old man in a bed, stripped bare. But children, do not think this was sadness without meaning. In the collapse of his kingdom, life forced honesty into him. And in the ruins of her despair, Coraline had found purpose she never knew belonged to her. She dedicated her days to the Morel Foundation, named for her mother. Each morning she arrived in shoes still worn thin, carrying papers in her hands and worry lines across her forehead. But no one saw her as a maid anymore. They called her Miss Morel, and they listened when she spoke. Imagine this shift, children, the invisible girl who lived in corners now sitting at tables, giving out instructions that changed lives. And yet, the humility never left her step. Every time she saw a woman bent over cleaning floors, she remembered her mother's cracked fingers and whispered, "I am doing this for you." The foundation grew so quickly that donors began circling. Some wanted to help. Some wanted to profit. Coraline, with sharp instincts gathered from years of watching the arrogance of wealth, learned to sniff out the difference. She took from those who gave with sincerity and turned away from those who sought only to fatten their own pride through the faces of the poor. Now, let me show you a picture. One of those evenings, Coraline stood at a gathering held in the heart of the city. The room glowed with warm light, filled with women who once scrubbed floors now teaching young girls, women who once cried into silence now singing softly with newfound dignity. Standing in that crowd, Coraline realized that her pain had carved something not bitter, but strong. She was not erased by her suffering. She was reshaped by it. And what of Victor, you ask? The old man sat at the back of such gatherings. His suits now were not tailored from the world's finest cloth but simple jackets, the kind that looked ordinary on his frame. He no longer demanded that people see him, and that was the quietest proof that he had changed. His riches remained gone, his name mocked in the papers, but the man was not entirely undone. He had been rebuilt, not in gold and glass, but in humility. I tell you this truth, children, that in some way only failure teaches. Victor, the man who once abandoned a woman and her child for ambition, began writing letters. Letters to Coraline, carefully written with trembling fingers, not always asking for her forgiveness, but promising what he could give, honesty, and the will to live the last of his days without hiding. And it is here where the strange beauty of quiet justice is found, not in crowns falling, but in walls breaking. He could not undo the decades. He could not return the years Coraline lived invisible. But his fall taught him that power is smaller than love, and silence heavier than truth. Children, HI viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. Now reflect with me. Would you accept those letters if you were Coraline? Would you read them as hope, or toss them as ashes? Coraline read them. Not at once, and not without tears. At first she hid them in drawers, refusing to look. But on nights when sleep was stolen from her by memories of hunger, she would open one letter. His words unraveled like confession, not excuses, not promises, just truth. And sometimes, truth, even in late hours, begins stitching wounds tighter. Not perfect, not erased, but tighter than before. The world around them watched too. Tabloids chased her foundation with curiosity. Some mocked her as maid with money, some praised her as the woman who turned her pain into promise. But Coraline did not chase their approval. She knew too well how easily the world pointed fingers. Instead, she chased the sound of quiet kitchens transformed into classrooms, and empty hands holding tools instead of rags. Something unexpected followed too. Those who had once mocked her in the hotel now came seeking jobs in her organization. And here, Coraline faced her greatest test. Could she forgive their arrogance, those who once treated her as nothing? She did not embrace them with open arms at first, no. But she did not deny them either. She allowed them to work, reminding herself that oppression does not belong only to kings, it belongs to anyone who ignores another person's dignity. And if she punished the poor for their ignorance the way she punished the powerful for their arrogance, she would become what she despised. And so she granted chances, not without boundaries, not without demands, but with the possibility that people, even the cruel ones, could transform. As for Victor's empire, it was torn apart, swallowed by rivals, renamed, reshaped, stolen. His enemies danced on his fall. But here is the paradox, children. Sometimes what men call defeat is the first hour of freedom. For no longer was Victor Draymont chained to skyscrapers and numbers. He was free to finally be a man, to admit, to regret, to walk with a real self instead of masks. Wealth had chained him far heavier than poverty ever chained Coraline. The old man's health never returned fully. Some days he walked with a stick, some days he sat in gardens, watching the clouds. And often, Coraline visited, not as the forgiving daughter, but as the honest one. She did not hug him with warmth, but she did not abandon him either. Justice gave her that choice, and she exercised it, not with hatred, not with romance, but with balance. When he looked at her, his eyes now softened. And when she looked at him, she did not see a titan of money anymore, but an old man facing his last chapters. Between them, not love, not constant rage, but something in between, an uneasy peace called truth. Let me remind you, children, reconciliation is not always forgiveness. Sometimes justice means living in the same room with an unspoken truce. Sometimes the punishment is that the guilty lives long enough to face the eyes of the ones they failed. The foundation rose across states. Coraline traveled, met politicians, business owners, common workers. Women knelt before her with gratitude, saying their lives were transformed. And yet, she never once forgot that she had once been unseen. She refused luxury homes, preferring an apartment that reminded her who she was. Because she feared that if she climbed into velvet, she might forget the cracks in her mother's hands. Now, children, let me pause here. Think with me. Would you give up luxury forever even if it was handed to you as restitution? Or would you surrender your humility for soft pillows and luxury air? It is easier to say no when you never had it. Coraline had it offered. And still she refused. That, my children, is the rarest kind of strength. I tell you now that years later the elderly narrator came back to the tale because people had begun whispering again, whispering not about the Iron King who once ruled, but about the Maid Queen who had risen. It was Coraline whom they began celebrating. They wrote about her, invited her to speak, lifted her name as a light. Victor died eventually, his body laying down into earth before he could witness the full growth of her empire. His grave, however, carried no corporate title, no giant letters. Only his name, and beneath it, one honest line: he sought redemption in truth, too late but never denied. Coraline did not cry loudly at his funeral. She did not sob as many expected. Instead, she stood quietly, her face still, her eyes soft, whispering to herself, "You left. You failed. But you admitted. And that is enough for me." Then she walked back to her foundation, back to the living, to the women who needed her. Children, let us close slowly. This is not only a story of a maid and a billionaire. It is the story of wounds carried, justice delivered, truth uncovered. It teaches that wealth can fall like a house of cards, but dignity, once built on truth, holds forever. It teaches that silent women can one day speak, and those who abandon them may one day be forced to listen. And finally, it teaches us not to wait until the rooftop is under your feet to seek healing. Because by then, sometimes, it is too late. This tale ends here, but life continues for Coraline and for you. Will you learn before silence turns into poison, or will you wait for fate to drag you into the storm? That decision rests with you, listeners, far beyond this tale. And now, subscribe, turn on your notifications, and share your thoughts below. Your words could inspire someone else who is fighting in silence, someone who feels invisible, someone who waits for justice. Share your story. It may be the voice another forgotten soul needs to hear. And so, my children, we place the book down tonight. Until the next story.